If you want to get to the bottom of a complicated issue, sometimes a simple pro and con list is the best place to start. Welcome everybody. Today's going to be all about trade, all things trade. We're going to talk about some of the pros and cons of international trade, and we're going to try this new kind of PowerPoint-oriented format and see how that treats us. So without further ado, let's dive in and let's build this pro and con list together, okay? All right. So should the U.S. trade with other countries? Let's dive in here. So first things first, our first pro is comparative advantage. Just like we talked about last week in our Serena Williams video, right? So important to the concept of, or like the idea of trade is going to be the concept of comparative advantage. All I'm talking about here is specializing and producing in the good that you have the lower opportunity cost in. So you're giving up less to make that good. Kind of a surface level example might be the U.S. specializes in creating software and making financial services, and a country like Vietnam might specialize in the production of clothes, something like that, right? So you specialize in something, and then we all trade, and we're all made better off. There'll be some links in the description to where I've talked about comparative advantage in the past, and also some other people that have talked about it before. I think this is hugely important. We got to thank one of our very first economists, David Ricardo, from the late 1700s, early 1800s, really clarifying why this is so critical and how it can really help everybody in the whole world be better off thanks to trade. So this graph here shows the value of global exports over the past couple hundred years, and as you can see, up and up and up, right? Trade, as it's become more available since the 1950s, has just absolutely taken off, and it's because we're all made better off by it, right? We can all get a lot richer, get a lot wealthier by engaging in trade. You know, free trade makes people richer. It's a fact. It doesn't come without its drawbacks, and we'll talk about those later. But these graphs and this concept of comparative advantage really show how much trade can help people get wealthier. So let's keep rolling on here. Next up, increased competition. Increased competition. So I think for this example, the car market is going to be a perfect thing to think of here. So I've got up here a Ford Fusion and a Toyota Camry. These are both very recent versions of these cars. But I think, you know, if you look at kind of the development of the car market over the last like 20 or 30 years, 30 years ago, the highest selling cars were definitely American made, right? In the 80s and the early 80s especially, you know, Oldsmobile and Chevrolet were definitely leading the market, right? But as the late 80s creeped in, Honda really started getting a competitive edge, selling a lot of Accords and Civics, right? Well, by the time the late 90s rolled around and the early aughts, and even through to today, Toyota has really been dominating as far as the highest selling car brand, and specifically the Toyota Camry is one of the highest selling cars, and it's because, you know, they make a reliable, affordable product, and that's very appealing to consumers. I'm sure there's no surprise by that, right? A reliable, affordable product, yeah, that's something we all want, especially in something as important as a car. And I think that's really caused American manufacturers to crank up what they're doing, to work a lot harder and really up their game. So, you know, increased competition abroad can really make all of us better off by driving our producers here at home to make better stuff. And I think, you know, you look at the recent Ford Fusion, the recent Chevys, even luxury brand competitors like Tesla. American cars are really up in their game recently, and like to see more of that, right? So trade's going to allow us to bring diverse people from diverse backgrounds together. I think this is something traditional kind of economics textbook might overlook, but I can't possibly overlook it. I get to talk about one of my best friends in the whole world. His name's Shohei. He lives in Japan. His dad came over to work with Toyota. They set up a plant here in Kentucky. I was so privileged to get to meet this fella. Really brilliant, kind guy, and getting that friendship that wouldn't have ever happened without Toyota coming to the United States, right? And maybe that's a little more specific than just international trade. That's a pretty unique relationship, right? Where a foreign company would invest and create a factory in the United States. But, there's some nuance to that situation. But I do think that international trade and the relationships between these companies in different countries is what allowed that relationship and so many relationships to flourish across the world, right? And I think it's a valuable thing, right? It's important that we get to meet people of different backgrounds and get to know people, right? This is how we grow as people. So what else we got? Build diplomatic relationships. I think this is huge. Trade can absolutely help us build diplomatic relationships. And my great example for this, what do we have here? We have a Big Mac, right? We have a Big Mac. Well, Mr. Owens, why do we have a Big Mac explaining how trade can help ease diplomatic relationships? Well, no two countries with a McDonald's franchise in their borders have been at war, ever. How about that? And there may be some selection bias, right? It may just be that the countries that have McDonald's franchises happen to have something else in common. So I don't think that it's the McDonald's franchise that are causing that. But I think what it is showing is that countries that trade a lot and have vested interests in each other are not very likely to go to war. And I think this is a very important thing to remember. Very important. So what else we got here? Diverse products. Diverse products. Allowing trade lets us get things that we wouldn't otherwise have. You can think back, years and years and years ago to like the 14 and 1500s. Why was trade so important? Well, they wanted spices and silks and things. You can think of the Silk Road as just this big trade route all across Asia, right? It was very hard to navigate the seas at this time, and it was a lot cheaper to cross the land road from Europe to Asia. And this allowed Asian countries to get European goods and European countries to get these unique goods from Asia. But a more recent example, I think, might perk you guys' interest. This graph, the blue line on this graph shows per capita consumption of pounds of avocados in the U.S. I think this is very interesting. So if you look, it starts in the 1990s. We were consuming about a pound a person, something like that, per year. But as we move along, notice I don't think this graph has a point for it, but right around here in the 1990s, we are going to have the passage of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And that is going to allow avocados to become much cheaper in the United States. Okay? Much cheaper. And also much more available. So avocados become available, people start trying them, and they become this huge thing that American consumers just love, right? We love our guacamole and more recently our avocado toasts, right? Just avocado toast is a multi-million-dollar industry now, right? I find that really interesting. So, allowing people to trade and freeing up trade can bring in new products that we didn't even know existed, like as in this case. So Our first con, some people are going to be made worse off. Some workers are going to be made worse off. This is one of the biggest critiques of international trade. So in the US, we can think of sending manufacturing jobs overseas. And I find it really interesting. This is something that politicians on both sides of the proverbial aisle agree on, that this is a major problem. And let me cut away. I'll show you guys a little bit from the president and a little bit from Senator Sanders, both talking about this problem and how it's very important to them, to both of these people, although very far apart politically. They both agree that these jobs going overseas is a big problem, and that losing manufacturing jobs to countries like China, to countries like Mexico, really can damage not just our economy as a whole, right? Because our economy as a whole, we get these cheaper goods, so we're probably made better off. But these specific individuals, you know, if you lose your job because of the opening of trade, the freeing up of trade, you're going to be very frustrated, right? This is a hard thing to go through.
Today is disappearing. The working class is being decimated. Median family income has declined over the last 9 years. And one of the reasons for that collapse of the middle class is the hemorrhaging of decent paying manufacturing jobs. And just give you some numbers that I think the American people may not be familiar with. During the Bush administration, just those 8 years, we went from 17 million manufacturing jobs to 12 million manufacturing jobs, a decline of 30%.
Border tax. So if you want to move to another country, and if you want to fire all of our great American workers that got you there in the first place, you can move from Michigan to Tennessee and to North Carolina and South Carolina. You can move from South Carolina back to Michigan. You can do anywhere. You got a lot of states at play, a lot of competition. So it's not like, oh, gee, I'm taking the competition. We got a lot of places you can move. And I don't care, as long as it's within the United States, the borders of the United States.
So how about that, right? Coming back in times of emergency, there could be a lack of needed goods. I think this is another very important point. So in a time of war, you don't want to rely on another country for the production of steel or for the production of food. You know, you want to have these kind of emergency related industries available in your country. And I don't really think there's a better example than what happened here recently with the COVID crisis. You know, at the start of this crisis a few months ago, we looked around, we said, oh my gosh, we need some gloves, we need some masks, we need some antibiotics, and we need them now, right? We need them yesterday. And we realized that all of these products were made mostly in China, right? They were made in China. And the Chinese were obviously also having a problem, major problem with this virus. And understandably, they made their people a priority. You know, it's not crazy from their perspective to say, hey, we're going to be at the front of the line when it comes to making masks, right? If we're going to make masks, we're going to give them to our people first. We're going to put ourselves at the front of this line, and we'll send them to you guys, and we're happy to trade with you guys. But, you know, it's emergency, and we come first. And, you know, this kind of showed a little bit of a hiccup, a little bit of a flaw in relying so much on other countries for important products and important resources. So what else we got here? Protecting infant industries. So this one's a little weird. This, I think, is a pretty strong argument against trade in very specific cases. So you can picture yourself as like the leader of a small business in a country that maybe doesn't have as much of a history of production of goods that compete on the world stage. So obviously, the U.S. has a long history of competing abroad, right? All kinds of products competing abroad. But maybe a smaller country, maybe a country in Africa or Southeast Asia, You're put in a position where you're a very small, say, toy company in Africa, and you can only produce so many goods. Well, maybe you can't compete with the vast quantity and low price and high quality of Chinese toys, you know, or very high quality toys out of maybe the U.S. or Europe, right? So maybe it would help you to have some barriers to trade, where you just get to trade with the people in your country until you build up your company's resources a little bit, and then you can trade on an international stage more competitively. And this is another argument against trading with other countries. Here's another one, cultural identity. Cultural identity. I think to some people, and maybe not to me, and maybe not to you, but to some people, this is very, very important. This is a very important stamp. It means something to some people, right? Buying American-made products is a priority to them. It means something that fellow compatriots were the ones that were producing the clothes they wear and the cars they drive and the food that they eat. And I respect that, right? You know, maybe there's some value to it. Maybe it has some spiritual or ethereal quality that people would really prize. I don't know that I find it to be so important for me, and maybe you don't either, but I do think that there are some people, maybe your grandparents or just your parents, find this to be something very valuable, right? And I'd say other countries see this as important too, right? Japanese people want to buy Japanese goods. English people want to buy English goods, and so on and so forth, right? This one I think is pretty huge. Unsavory practices abroad. Unsavory practices abroad. So when you think of how most of the clothes that we wear are made, unfortunately, it is going to be in shops that look maybe something like this, right? These are often called like sweatshops. They're potentially pretty dangerous, not great places to work. Potentially there's going to be some child labor that goes on. Right now, it's very sad to say that some of the masks that are being worn are made with slave labor in China. There seems to be pretty strong evidence of that. And that's very unfortunate. And we can't control the business practices in another country, right? We don't get a say in how China treats its workers. Now, we do get a say within our borders, right? We get to set the minimum wage, we get to set the maximum amount of hours you can work in a week, stuff like that, if we choose to, right? We can put these limitations and safety nets in place. Now, I do want to mention these people that choose to work in factories like this, they're often choosing to do this because it's making them richer. You know, if you live in China and you can't find a job, you're in a really tough spot, you can't find a job, you're having a hard time, your family's struggling to find food, and Nike comes in and has a new shoe factory, and they're gonna make millions of shoes, and the people in your city are gonna help them do it. You know, you might be helped a lot by the building of that factory. That may be very beneficial to you. And so I don't want to bash the business practices abroad too much, because they do raise people out of poverty, and it's complicated is what I'd like to say. So maybe it's unsavory and maybe it's not right, you know, maybe it's immoral, but it is complicated because maybe these people don't have a better alternative, at least not now, right? And I believe we're pulling in, last but not least, may cause diplomatic frictions is my last point here. May cause diplomatic frictions. And I don't think that trade itself does this, but when we monkey with our trade policy, I do think it can have this effect. If you look when President Trump first took office, he definitely took up some issues with China, right? And there were new tariffs, lots of new frictions in our trade policy. The media referred to it as a trade war. These maybe don't make us better off, and maybe this makes it harder for our countries to get along. And I think there's no better example of this than this picture here. Does anybody know where this is from? This is from Pearl Harbor. And I know what you're thinking. Well, what does Pearl Harbor have to do with international trade and our trade policy? Well, unfortunately, many historians argue that Pearl Harbor was essentially caused by the U.S.'s trade policy. And before you get too far away from me here, before you get losing it on me and saying it was a unprovoked attack and all that jazz, in the 1930s, the U.S. was the main exporter of oil, right? We were supplying the world's oil to a great extent, okay? And Japan is not well known for its vast resources of oil, right? This is not something that they've got on hand. So Japan is starting to militarize, right? And they're spreading their control across, the Southeast Pacific and into, the Southeast Asia, right? I suppose the Southwest Pacific, right? And into China as well. And so they're really running a military campaign across Asia. And this was not different than a lot of countries had been doing. It was still a very imperialist time back in the 1930s. You can think the U.S. owning Cuba was only 30 years before that. So really a pretty imperialist time for the whole world. But the U.S. didn't care for Japan spreading its wings like that and conquering so much territory so quickly. And so as a response, we declared an oil embargo against Japan. An oil embargo. An embargo just means we are not going to sell you any oil, right? And Japan took that as a slap in the face. I believe that was in the late 1930s, like 38, if I remember correctly. They took that as the same as an act of war against Japan, right? They took that very seriously. That was a very serious slight to them. And so when Pearl Harbor happened to the U.S., it was very surprising to us because it was the first outright violence between us and Japan. But to Japan, in a lot of their eyes, and from their perspective, this oil embargo that really hurt their military and hurt their ability to fuel their war machine was a big slap in the face. And it was essentially an act of war, right? It was an economic act of war. So here's the deal, guys. Trade, just like pretty much every economic issue that we're going to talk about over the course of this class, is not cut and dry. It's difficult, and it's value-laden, and trying to act like there's a simple answer to what U.S. trade policy should be is just not going to cut it, right? So don't trust the guy on the TV that's telling you, oh, trade good or oh, trade bad. I think overall, over the course of history, you would definitely say trade between people and between countries is a force for good and for wealth creation, and that's an awesome thing. But there are definitely some drawbacks to it, some nuance to this issue. So, yeah, think about it for yourself, and I'll see you guys next time. Thank you.